Hello, my name is Jason Nye. I'm a professor of literature and film as well as a writer, and I'm happy to have the chance to talk with you about this low-budget, late 50s blend of science fiction and horror. I might as well get this out of the way first. Yes, this film enjoys the distinction, or notoriety perhaps, of being riffed by Mystery Science Theater 3000. I bring that up now to let you know that I will not be taking that approach with this track. The folks at that show are very good at what they do, and I've been a huge fan of their work since I was a teenager, but if you want to listen to someone joke about this movie throughout its running time, I encourage you to check out MST3K Season 4, Episode 7. On this track, I'll be playing it mostly straight, by breaking down specific scenes, talking about the people who made this film, getting into the behind-the-scenes details of its production history, its distribution, and critical reception, explaining where it fits under the larger umbrella of 1950s sci-fi, and how it has, over the decades, become a cult favorite for the connoisseurs of this kind of movie. I also played it safe and didn't go back and watch that MST3K episode in advance of the screening, because I didn't want it to color my judgment in any way. Now, speaking of my own personal judgment of this film, I should say at the outset here that I will not be arguing this is some forgotten masterpiece and that its many critics have gotten it all wrong. When measured by many of the traditional metrics we use to distinguish good films from bad, this movie's bad. But that doesn't mean that it's not entertaining, because like so many low-budget films from this era, in its own campy way, it is. This establishing shot was most likely filmed on Lake Dallas in Texas. And then we'll move into a close-up, which is clearly shot while these two men are not actually out on the lake. Here, we get our introduction to Thorne Sherman, who's played by James Best, and Rook Griswold, played by Judge Henry Dupree. I'll talk about both men later. For now, because it will provide a foundational understanding for everything that I will discuss later, I think it's important to first talk about the man who willed this film into existence and who also plays Dr. Radford Baines. This movie marked a brief sojourn into filmmaking for one of America's most important figures in the history of radio broadcasting. Gordon McClendon's nickname was the Maverick of Radio, and his life story makes for a truly fascinating tale. McClendon, who was born and spent a good chunk of his childhood in Texas, developed his interest in radio when he was still in high school. After attending Yale and briefly considering a career in law, he ditched that plan and, after serving in World War II, returned to the States and pursued his first love of broadcasting. Over the decades, he would eventually amass a giant network of stations and a giant fortune. But before all that, when he was just a broadcaster in the late 1940s, he made a name for himself, literally, by creating a character called the Old Scotchman, who broadcast quote-unquote live calls of baseball games from around the country. There were only three problems with this. The Old Scotchman wasn't real, the broadcasts weren't live, and the sounds of the game his listeners heard in the background weren't from the actual games. What he did was recreate the games from the ground up for broadcast. In his Dallas studio, he'd get the game stats via Western Union wires just minutes after they'd actually happened, and then use them as a template for what the Old Scotchman would say, while he filled in the background noise with pre-recorded sounds. You might be wondering why he did this, rather than just buying the rights to rebroadcast the local market's announcers. Well, at first, he couldn't afford it, but then Major League Baseball told him he couldn't, so he just decided he'd do it himself. You can see how he got the nickname the Maverick of Radio. This is definitely the most beautiful shot in the entire film and a rare moment of aesthetically pleasing composition that follows the rule of thirds. With a background that captures the clouds in the sky, the island in the distance, and the gentle waves while foregrounding the dock, it almost looks like a painting. I know this film has gotten knocked over the years for its at times glacial pacing, but in this case, I don't mind that we linger on this image. Note the upcoming dialogue. The script bombards us with a ton of nautical lingo in the opening moments.
Oh, she'll ride like a duck. If she swings too far to starboard, we might have to take a check line to shore. Hey, Rook, take a slant up that trail.
Okay, back to McClendon. During his baseball broadcasts, he was truly committed to verisimilitude. He had 4 record players at his disposal, all with crowd noise recorded at various levels, so if, say, a player hit a home run, he'd play a recording of a crowd going wild. If he wanted to have someone in the stands at a Yankees game heckle a player, he had recordings he'd made in every baseball town in the country at the ready, so the accent of the heckler would match their supposed location. He'd crack a stick in his studio against something to mimic the bat striking the ball, and he'd take the mic into the bathroom to get a better echo when playing the part of the PA announcer. And he had no problem duping his listeners because, after all, it was coming from a good place. He wanted to entertain all the baseball fans who were tuning in. His programs eventually eclipsed the popularity of the local broadcasts of real games and became the first nationally broadcast games across his Liberty Broadcasting network, reaching an estimated 30 million listeners. In 1951, he even won the America's Outstanding Sports Broadcaster Award from the Sporting News. But baseball owners hated what he was doing because his broadcasts were more entertaining than the real thing. When fans who'd only heard the old Scotchman's highly dramatic recreations eventually showed up to watch a game in person, owners said they left disappointed and went back to listening to his broadcast, which hurt their ticket sales. But this practice of out-of-market announcers recreating games from almost up-to-the-minute stats delivered via teletype eventually kept catching on, with other folks getting in on the act. And one of those individuals who announced those recreated games was none other than future President Ronald Reagan. Once, when someone asked McClendon if he felt any guilt over the ruse, he responded, quote, "This kind of question infuriates me. I was happy as hell to be able to entertain our listeners. What harm is there in making 100,000 people happy on a hot summer afternoon?" End quote. Here's our first glimpse at the ramshackle building where these low-rent scientific experiments are taking place. I'll get into some of the problems the cast had with this set later on once we move inside it. Eventually, competitors who broadcast the real games caught up, and with the cooperation of Major League Baseball, which had been looking for a way to muscle McClendon out, were able to put the old Scotchman out to pasture. But that wasn't before he helped launch the careers of broadcasters who called the real games, including legendary Dodgers announcer Vin Scully.
You've been out of communication for more than a week, Captain.
Can't it be fixed?
It's totally out of commission. My assistants, Mr. Farrell, Jerry Farrell.
Father, perhaps the captain would enjoy a drink.
Well, of course. Will you join us in a cocktail?
Well, I've never been known to turn down a drink yet. I'll be glad to.
And thus begins an astonishing amount of drinking. Despite the demise of his baseball broadcasts, McClendon had learned how to pivot into a more diversified product offering, and along the way he'd been buying up stations around the country. At its peak, his company owned 458 radio stations. He popularized the top 40 format for music programming and started the first all-news radio station. In the early 60s, when the government-approved British radio wouldn't play rock music, including the Beatles, McClendon got his hands on a retrofitted old fishing boat that had been turned into a seaborne radio station, parked it off the European shoreline, and blasted rock and roll into the continent's radio sets. While this was his idea, he wasn't the only one to do this, and a fictionalized version of that history would be turned into the 2009 movie Pirate Radio.
Well, to each his own. If you have to be isolated for your work, you've picked a lonely little island.
Excuse me, please. I think I'll change.
As clumsy as it is, that serves as an important interaction since, as the first time Sherman unsuccessfully hits on Anne, it establishes her discomfort with him and begins the oppositional character arc of their eventual love story, if you could even call it that. The script certainly doesn't strain itself to craft well-rounded characters. Ah, there's Gordon McClendon. He was a true innovator in radio. He invented the live traffic report, on-the-spot reporting done live out in remote locations, and the ad jingle, just one element of his expertise when it came to marketing. He invented all sorts of radio calling contests and other promotional stunts. And that ad work led to his interest in filmmaking. But before we get to that here, enjoy some scientific mumbo-jumbo.
I'd like you to meet Captain Thorne Sherman. This is my other assistant, Radford Baines.
How do you do?
2 new litters since lunch, Doctor. Both support GT116.
That's good, but
We can breed them to the 205 group in about 3 weeks. But I'd prefer to wait and expose about half of them to the Hoskins factor first, if you agree.
I thought it would be interesting to compare the scientific ideas about shrews presented in this film to the scientific realities of actual shrews. However, before I get into this, I want to make it clear that I am not a scientific expert. I didn't even make it through the first semester of my pre-med major before realizing, mostly due to my plummeting GPA, that the world would be a much safer place if I immediately abandoned my half-baked pursuit of becoming a medical doctor. But thankfully, I can here rely on the work of Mark C. Glassy, who has written about the scientific facts versus fiction in this film in not one but two books, The Biology of Science Fiction Cinema and Biology Run Amok, The Life Lessons of Science Fiction Cinema.
Think what would happen if you could isolate and identify the inherited factor in each gene.
Now, wait a minute. I'm afraid I'm not very good with pure research.
This is practical research. Generally among mammals, the smaller the size, the higher the metabolism and the shorter the lifespan.
Is that right?
Well, I'm attempting to decrease the size while maintaining a low metabolism and resultant a longer lifespan.
What reason?
Overpopulation. Not a problem now, but it will be in time. If we were half as big as we are now, we could live twice as long on our natural resources.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here, and there will be more from Craigus about the shrews in a few minutes. So first, does the film get the characteristics of a shrew correct? Well, here's how Glassy describes a real shrew. Quote, "Shrews are small mole-like mammals that have a long, sharp snout, spike-like teeth, and voracious appetites, and unusually high metabolic rates. Shrews must eat 80 to 90% of their body weight every day. Dr. Craigus exaggerates they must eat 3 times their own weight every 24 hours. Shrews have poisonous saliva, and their bite can be fatal to humans. Bitten humans can die of hemotoxic syndrome from shrew saliva." End quote. Okay, now what does Glassy claim the film gets right? Well, he says that even though it's an exaggeration, the general idea of a shrew needing to eat its own body weight per day is correct. Quote, "With mammals, especially small ones, their body size is a problem. This mostly has to do with maintaining homeostatic body temperature. Since mammals are warm-blooded, they generate a lot of body heat, and this usually dissipates out of the body through natural openings and pores in the skin. The bigger the mammal, the more insulation there is from the body's mass. This insulation helps to maintain the body's internal heat. Small mammals, like the shrew, have to consume a lot of food to maintain their body heat, because they have very little insulation to keep the heat in. This is why the shrew and others, like the kangaroo rat, have to constantly eat. As Craigus correctly says, among mammals, the smaller the size, the higher the metabolism, and the shorter the lifespan." End quote. He also says that Craigus using shrews for his experiment subjects, because of their short lifespan, tracks as well. Quote, "This is one of the main reasons many biomedical students use small rodents, because of their short breeding times and the ability to analyze traits over relatively short genetic distances. All of this is a reflection of real science and well done." End quote.
Progress, Doctor. This is the sole survivor of Group 30. 28 months old today.
Well, that's equivalent to 140 years to us.
That's right, yet it still maintains low metabolism without any sluggishness.
It's not the breakthrough, but it certainly sets our course. Radford, suspend series 52 through 96, and we'll concentrate on the rest.
What is that?
It's a Sorex cericidae.
Looks like a small rat. Smells like a skunk.
They have musk glands in their knees. And these little fellows are our subjects. They have a birth cycle of 10 to 14 days. And using them, we can establish traits. We can trace the progressions through a number of generations over a short period of time.
Now that I've discussed what the film gets right, it's time to cover what it gets wrong. A big flaw in Craigus's reasoning is linear extrapolation, which Glassy identifies as a common flaw in the supposed science in sci-fi films. Quote, "Attributes are expected to remain the same when organisms increase or decrease in size. This is simply not true. As an organism significantly increases its body mass, it does not have the same movements nor appetite. Conversely, as an organism significantly decreases its body mass, it has more mobility and must feed more frequently." End quote. As Glassy points out, Craigus's idea that shrinking humans to half their size so they would live twice as long is simply not borne out in the real world already. Quote, "If true, then dwarves and other small people should be able to live twice as long as fully grown adults." End quote. And obviously, this doesn't happen. Also, the dialogue in the film suggests that the mutant shrews are eating way too much food for their size.
Animals, a lot like the mole. They feed only at night unless they're starving. And when they are hungry enough, they'll tackle anything regardless of size.
No kidding.
Mm-hmm. If you leave 2 of them in a cage for 12 hours without food, the stronger will eat the weaker.
Like cannibals.
Precisely.
As Glassy puts it, quote, "That is a diet for a whale, not a dog-sized shrew," end quote. A couple of other problems. Craigus doesn't seem to understand what a gene is because he mentions isolating and identifying the inherent factor in each gene. But a gene itself is an inherent factor. This would be like saying you wanted to find and isolate the apple within the apple. And finally, the poison the mutant shrews ingest wouldn't stay in their salivary glands. It would pass through their body and get digested. So later on, Mario shouldn't be killed by the poison in this way. So overall, a mixed bag when it comes to presenting the science, but frankly, the fact that it got any of it right was more than I was expecting.
I'll get you one.
Here comes another drink. In 1954, McClendon started contracting with movie studios, which paid him to craft radio commercials for their films. And that eventually got him thinking. In June 1959, Variety ran a feature article and interview with McClendon that begins with his musing, quote, "If we can sell pictures, we can make pictures," end quote. Because he owns 6 radio stations in the Dallas area, as well as a lot of drive-in movie theaters, McClendon figured that if he made pictures with low enough budgets and blanketed his own radio stations with ads for them, which would effectively be free airtime, he was all but guaranteed to make at least his money back and then some just on Texas showings alone. To this end, he formed a company called McClendon Radio Pictures, and in the Variety piece readily admitted that he didn't have, quote, "the vaguest idea of what I'm doing, but I'm trying to learn," end quote. He also admitted he wished he knew more about how to distribute films into foreign markets. Part of his plan to get the films out of Texas and into theaters around the country involved ads in the industry trade papers. When Variety ran its review of the Killer Shrews, he took out a full-page ad on the opposite page that read, quote, "Dazzling in Dallas, fabulous in Fort Worth. Killer Shrews and the Giant Gila Monster shatter all-time interstate house record. For booking information, contact McClendon Radio Pictures," end quote. I'll talk more about that production and financials later. McClendon told Variety he planned to make as many as a dozen films, all with budgets between $75,000 and $150,000. And he'd started making moves in that direction. In addition to this film and the Giant Gila Monster, he made a kids movie called My Dog Buddy. And he wasn't afraid to put his money where his mouth was. He forked over $500,000 for 500 acres in the Lake Dallas area and spent another $250,000 building a combined studio and living space, which he called the Cielo Studio. Part of his plan involved casting people with at least some name recognition, but who were still affordable. To this end, he signed former beauty pageant winners with little to no acting experience. Former Miss Sweden Ingrid Good is in this film, and former Miss France Lisa Simone is in The Giant Gila Monster. Good won Miss Sweden in 1956 and then headed to Hollywood, where she signed a brief contract with Universal. By the time she made this film, she had gone freelance and had about a dozen credits under her belt, mostly small roles scattered across TV and film. In 1962, she married Jerry Orbach, and no, not the actor from Law & Order. Orbach was president of his family's department stores. He was 54 and already had 5 kids from 2 previous marriages, so at age 25, she became a very busy stepmother. She retired from acting and went on to have 4 kids of her own. As of this recording, I believe she's the only cast member who's still alive. And McClendon also cast himself, not just as a cost-saving measure, but because he said it would, quote, "give it a little more name value because I am well known in many states as a broadcaster," end quote. This is definitely a time capsule moment, capturing an era when just a sizable majority of Americans smoked. And then, here comes Jealous Jerry, played by Ken Curtis. This love triangle dynamic is one of the film's funnier elements. Jerry keeps trying to claw back what he's lost, and Thorne's eventual move is to just punch him. Also, this door really gets a workout in this film.
Wow. This is certainly a cozy little scene. Might even be called intimate. Boy meets girl and all.
Stop it, Jerry. That remark is uncalled for. What I do or have to say does not concern you.
I can't disagree with you more, my dear. I'm concerned with everything you do, and I intend to keep it that way. Now, in my book, an engagement isn't a casual thing.
In my book, it isn't either. And last night ended ours.
That was one of the smoothest exits from a relationship spat that I've ever seen. And here, we get our introduction to the Killer Shrews. And the decision to have us hear them before we see them is actually pretty effective, because the sounds they make are genuinely unsettling. Of course, once we do see them, that terror goes right out the window because the shrews in question are just dogs with clumps of extra hair and pieces of carpet stuck onto them. It's safe to say the American Humane Society did not monitor the animal action in this film. Judge Henry Dupree, who's playing the doomed Rook, was a Dallas local, and McClendon also cast him in his kids' movie My Dog Buddy. Those are his only 2 screen roles. He probably worked for McClendon in some capacity at his radio station KLIF, because McClendon pulled from that pool of employees when casting the smaller parts in both this film and The Giant Gila Monster. When promoting this film, McClendon said, quote, "Dallas, Texas may give the film capital of the world a run for its money," end quote. And by 1960, he was publicly promoting the idea of turning Cielo into a hub for A-list filmmaking and prepping his 4th film, another kids movie called Tuffy Scott's Dog. But neither that movie nor any of his other film projects, such as an original story based on Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer character, ever got off the ground. While his 3 films themselves had made good money, the startup costs for McClendon Radio Pictures had kept the company itself from turning any sort of meaningful profit. And McClendon ultimately wasn't convinced he could duplicate their success in a changing filmmaking landscape, especially with the limited on-hand talent in Dallas. Plus, his interest had shifted into politics. In the mid-60s, he ran unsuccessfully for both senator and governor of Texas. But he could never quite shake the movie industry bug. In the late 60s, he spun up construction on a Western set at CLO to rent out to other productions, which he did. He ran a successful chain of theaters throughout Texas starting in 1969. And he made a killing buying up blocks of Columbia Pictures stock in the 70s just before Coca-Cola bought the company, netting him in excess of 400% return on his investment. In the early 80s, he had enough self-awareness to know he'd gotten too old to get back into the game as a director, but he did take a role as an executive producer on the John Huston-directed film Victory. It bombed, but McClendon, ever the shrewd businessman, made sure beforehand that he'd come out ahead financially, which he did. Then, in March 1984, just 2 years before he would pass away, an article titled "McClendon, a True Texas Character" by Dennis McDougal of the Los Angeles Times outlined the Mavericks' biggest push into filmmaking to date, an $80 million investment in films to be spread out over 6 or 7 projects. McClendon is quoted as saying, quote, "We have $40 million in place and the other $40 million will come from me and what I get my friends to put up. Or we may make a public offering," end quote. This time around, he wanted to tackle more literary properties, including adaptations of works by F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ayn Rand. But his battle with cancer would keep these plans in the planning stage. In 1986, he passed away not long after Forbes had named him one of the wealthiest men in America, with a net worth of approximately $200 million. In 1994, he was voted into the Radio Hall of Fame.
You can't leave. No one opens that gate after dark.
Well, who's gonna stop me? You?
Well, this. No one opens that gate at night.
Now, look, I don't ask questions because it's against my principles.
This scene escalates very quickly. Why was that gun just sitting on the mantle? Also, Thorne shakes off being threatened with a firearm in record time, and he doesn't ask questions as a life principle? That seems like an odd hill to die on. Now, before I move on from McClendon's life story, I can't not share a couple of tasty morsels for all of you JFK assassination conspiracy theorists. Joan Mellon's book, A Farewell to Justice, Jim Garrison, JFK's Assassination, and the Cast That Should Have Changed History, covers New Orleans prosecutor Garrison's attempts to get to the bottom of the famous case. In the book, a colorful character named E. Carl McNabb appears. McNabb had worked as a contract pilot for the CIA, but then became an ally of Garrison's work, eventually joining Garrison's team as one of his investigators as they sought to stage a successful prosecution of the culprit or culprits behind the assassination. McNabb operated under the alias Jim Rose, and in February 1968, during a mission to Mexico City to troll the country's Soviet embassy for information on the assassination, McNabb, undercover as Rose, told 2 women he was trying to impress that there was a profile in the latest edition of Newsweek of the man who had put up the money that was needed to finance JFK's assassination. That person's name? Gordon McClendon. But wait, there's more. According to a November 1975 article by Gary Cartwright in Texas Monthly, Jack Ruby, who shot and killed JFK assassin Lee Harvey Oswald, was a great admirer of McClendon's, once identifying him as the world's greatest American. When Ruby was on trial for murder, he wrote a letter to McClendon, telling him his jailers were poisoning him and saying he was weighing hiring a PR man to help with his image. Coincidence or conspiracy? As I briefly mentioned earlier, this film was shot in the Lake Dallas area, about 30 miles northwest of downtown Dallas. In pre-production, McClendon admitted in a letter to a friend that it was not smooth sailing, writing, quote, "I am going very quietly crazy, getting ready to shoot our 2 epic productions starting here in January. These are turning out to be horror pictures in every sense of the word," end quote. The shoot wrapped on Friday, January 30th, 1959, just 6 days after it started. Its original budget was $300,000, but McClendon cut it down to around $125,000, which is just under the $138,000 he spent making the Giant Gila Monster. The 2 films had their world premiere in Dallas at the Majestic Theater on June 25, 1959, and McClendon was able to secure nationwide distribution for both through American International Pictures, or AIP, where kindred spirit Roger Corman had been working. This meant the films did eventually play in major markets around the country, including New York City, which we know in part because when Tony Curtis is walking across the city street in the 1960 romantic comedy The Rat Race, a giant theater marquee above him advertises 2 first-run shocking hits, The Killer Shrews and The Giant Gila Monster. At the time, this national reach would have been somewhat unusual for a film like this, because this was still very much the era of regional filmmaking. Today, we're used to a film receiving national distribution through a network of theater chains such as AMC or Cinemark. But back then, in the wake of the 1948 Supreme Court antitrust decision that forced movie studios to divest from their own individual theater chains and cease the practice of forced block booking, theaters were often independently owned and operated, or part of regional chains, such as the network of drive-in theaters that McClendon owned. Studios had networks of regional salesmen who would travel to these areas to sell their product. And even up through the 1980s, it wasn't uncommon for a low-budget independent film to be made in a particular region of the country and then play in theaters that were limited to that region. These films wouldn't get exposed to a national audience until they started getting shown on TV, or by the end of the 80s, started appearing around the country on VHS. A perfect late-stage example of this trajectory from regional success to national cult hit is Sam Raimi's first Evil Dead film. This is one of my favorite moments as Jerry starts mean-mugging Thorne as he walks out of the room. Ken Curtis throws some great dirty looks throughout this movie. Okay, here it comes. Okay, once these movies opened on a double bill, this and the Giant Gila Monster were a rousing financial success, playing to sold-out shows throughout Texas and raking in more than 5 times their original budgets. Even though she hated the film, and I'll read you her review later, Marie Stevenson of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram reported 3 days after its premiere that it and the Giant Gila Monster were, quote, entertaining great hordes of the younger generation daily, end quote. And this film was still playing in Texas all the way through late 1960, behind other films such as AIP's How to Make a Monster.
That left-handed dinner invitation, that was just to keep me here till after dark, wasn't it?
I wanted you here tonight. I felt something terrible was going to happen.
Well, you still feel the same way about it?
Not as much. Not since you're here and know everything. I love an open fire, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
The wind has a lonesome sound, doesn't it?
Sure does.
Like in Sweden, we don't have a wind this strong. You're a strange man, Thorne. I never met anyone like you.
Oh?
You seem so disinterested in everything. Aren't you the least bit curious? Don't you wonder about the unusual things around here? The guns, the fence, the shattered windows, my accent, anything?
I'll tell you something. I'm only interested in anything that concerns me, then I do something about it.
Again, there's a lot going on here. First, Thorne is really not endearing himself to Anne or anyone else with his proudly myopic view of the world. It's almost as if he was originally crafted to be a kind of attractive bad boy character, but in moments like that, he just comes across as a jerk. But then, he immediately undercuts this lone wolf persona by running to the gate and putting himself in danger by attempting to rescue Rook. As I said earlier, this film's focus is not on crafting compelling characters. And while Jerry definitely has zero redeeming qualities, I will defend this specific character moment because Thorne was absolutely on his way to open that gate. Then we'll get some more great mean mugging from Ken Curtis here. But also, Anne says that Sweden doesn't ever have strong winds? That's an example of this film's dodgy, even nonsensical dialogue from screenwriter Jay Sims, who also scripted The Giant Gila Monster. Somewhat improbably, these projects launched him into a 2-decade-long career in Hollywood, writing mostly for TV shows such as Have Gun Will Travel, The Rifleman, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., and Gunsmoke. He also penned 2 1962 post-apocalyptic sci-fi dramas, Panic in Year Zero and The Creation of the Humanoids. Apparently, the latter was Andy Warhol's favorite film. His career is a textbook example of why you never judge a writer's entire body of work by their first efforts, since they, given the right opportunities, can improve exponentially over time.
Produce unusual results.
Good grief, there's a lot of drinking happening. It's not just Jerry, but he does perpetually seem to be one drink away from rock bottom. He might be the screen's most severe alcoholic since Ray Milland in The Lost Weekend.
It's not a problem for the government or military. The world is in no danger. This species does not swim. And as far as the shrews are concerned, this island is their world.
Very soon, right here on this island, is going to be a miniature reproduction of an overpopulated world. And you'll see the importance of what we're working to avoid.
This bit of dialogue from Craigus and Baines places them firmly within the tradition of fictional scientists who believe they have placed adequate guardrails in place for their experiments they believe will help humanity, only to see their best-laid plans go to ruin once their work goes off the rails, forcing them to reckon with how little control they actually exert over the forces of nature. Baruch Lumet plays Craigus, and this film seems deeply at odds with the type of project he would usually take. To explain why, I'll need to get into his background. He was born in Warsaw, Poland in 1898, where he attended and graduated from the Warsaw Academy of Dramatic and Musical Arts. He married Eugenia, a fellow actor and dancer, and after he acted on stage in Poland for a couple of years, they made a brief sojourn to London and then immigrated to the United States, where they were both active in the Yiddish theater. Eugenia died when their 2 children were young, and the family moved to New York City, where Baruch began acting and writing radio dramas in 1932 and then breaking into Broadway in 1934, at a time when his left-wing politics were in vogue among a lot of folks in the theater scene, especially the group theater. By the end of the 1930s, he'd put together his own one-man show titled Mono Theater Varieties, which was successful enough for him to take it on the road and perform it around America from 1939 through 1946. He also wrote the socially conscious plays 3 Steps Down in 1946 and Once Upon a Tailor in 1953. By this point, he was well known as a motivated and determined theater actor whose writings and performances dealt with serious political issues. His reputation was such that in 1953, he accepted a position as the director of the Dallas Institute of Performing Arts in the Knox Street Theater. He held this job until 1960, which accounts for how he and Gordon McClendon crossed paths. It does not, however, account for why he took this role. I'm guessing it was for the money because it couldn't have been for the art. Now, you might not be familiar with Baruch's work on the screen, but if you're a film fan at basically any level, I can guarantee you know his son's work, because his son was Sidney Lumet, who grew up to be one of the greatest directors of the second half of the 20th century. After working in TV for several years, Sidney's 1957 directorial debut, 12 Angry Men, remains a bona fide classic, and he followed it up with an incredible track record that includes Long Day's Journey into Night, Failsafe, Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, Network, Prince of the City, Night Falls on Manhattan, and Before the Devil Knows You're Dead. His dad was instrumental in raising him into the world of performing. When he was just 4 years old, Sidney and his father appeared together in a Yiddish theater production in New York City. When Sidney was 11, they acted together in what would be Sidney's only film appearance in the politically charged drama 1939's 1/3 of a Nation. Not long after Baruch acted in this film, they served as the uncredited casting directors together for a low-budget sci-fi film, 1960's Beyond the Time Barrier, which was shot in Fort Worth, Texas. And then, once Sidney established his directorial career, he cast his dad in 2 of his films, The Pawnbroker in '64 and The Group in '66.
You know what I've been thinking about, Mario? Anne and that captain, you and me. Imagine an intelligent girl like her going for a common sea tramp like him.
Sea tramp. That's the best line in this film. Ken Curtis is the MVP who really does elevate this film to another level of enjoyment. And playing Mario is Alfredo De Soto, who already had over 15 years of acting experience by the time he made this movie, almost all of it in small roles, mostly uncredited bit parts and productions made in his native Mexico. Outside of a bit part in the 1949 comedy noir The Big Steal, which was mostly shot in Mexico, this is the only American production in which he acted.
I'm going to trust you to take my turn at patrolling the house. But when you finish, don't wake the captain. Come back here and get me. See, I'll probably feel good enough by then to take his turn. Okay, Mario?
See.
Okay.
Not only did Jerry just pawn off his work on Mario, but prior to that, he showed how terrible he is by trying to create the kind of screw everybody else alliance with Mario that wouldn't be out of place on the TV show Survivor. Oh, and FYI, anytime you see close-ups of the shrew heads like we just did, those are hand puppets. Mario's gonna go investigate the house's defenses and discover that someone left the window open. Who would do that? Oh wait, right, Jerry. Just like with Baruch Lumet, this role of Jerry represents an outlier part for Ken Curtis because his defining role is undoubtedly Deputy Sheriff Festus Hagen on the decade-spanning TV western Gunsmoke. After guest starring as a few different characters starting the same year as this film, Curtis started his run as Festus in 1962 and went on to play him for more than 300 episodes, all the way through until the show's final season in 1975. The Western genre defined his career since he came up as a singing cowboy during the dying embers of its popularity on screen, then transitioned into mainstream Westerns, often taking up a supporting role behind John Wayne in films directed by his father-in-law, John Ford, such as the 1956 classic The Searchers. That filmic terrain probably would have felt at least somewhat familiar for him, given his childhood experience growing up as the son of a sheriff on the plains of southeastern Colorado. His family lived in the small town of Las Animas, in the building that housed the Bent County Jail. The prisoners occupied rooms with barred windows on the second floor, while the family lived on the first. His mom served as the jail's de facto cook. Both his singing and acting careers were so closely aligned with the Western that in 1981, a decade before he passed away, he was voted into the Western Performers Hall of Fame. So while this role is definitely outside his usual wheelhouse, he took it in part because McClendon offered him the opportunity to not just act in it, but, for the first time in his career, serve as one of the film's producers.
I don't want you to let anybody open that door till I tell you.
For me personally, and I have to imagine it's this way for other fans of sci-fi films from this era, it's been sometimes tough to appreciate these movies, because experiencing them as they would have looked during their original theatrical runs has until recently proved challenging, especially for low-budget films like this one. And this problem goes double for this particular movie, which has long since lapsed into the public domain, which means any fly-by-night outfit can put out an inferior home video version, provided they have access to at least some cruddy 16mm print that can barely make it through the scanning process. Without naming names, that's definitely what's happened with this movie over the decades, so when I first saw this remastered version, it was like the scales fell from my eyes. I'm confident in saying that because of how good this new release looks and sounds, this is now the definitive home video version of this movie. It can finally be appreciated for what it is, both good and bad, because this has to be the best it has looked since it debuted in a Dallas theater back in 1959.
Aquí. You see anything? I see where he was. I do not see where he is.
Cuidado.
Sí, señor. I will be careful.
That's a surprisingly gory moment for a film from the late 50s. Also, by now it's probably clear to you that the musical score does a lot of heavy lifting. There's only so much tension the music can ratchet up when backstopping two people slowly wandering around a dark room, but music industry veterans Emil Cadkin and Harry Bluestone do their best. They're both highly competent musicians. Bluestone was an accomplished violinist whose recordings and songs have been used in dozens of films, up through as recently as 2021. I have a question about this shot, and I might be showing my ignorance of emergency medicine here, again, failed pre-med student, but why is Thorne making a tourniquet by using his gun? That seems unsafe. With Mario's death, I think it's worth bringing up a December 1974 issue of the magazine The Monster Times, in which editor Joe Kane pens a piece titled "The Monster Times Lousy Film Department proudly presents another lousy film, The Killer Shrews." The intro describes the movie as, quote, "a tale of science going wrong, giant shrews running amok, patrons fleeing from theaters, and weary watchers dozing in front of the tube," end quote. Kane lobs a number of criticisms at the film, but one in particular stuck out to me. On more than one occasion, Kane describes what he perceives as the film's racist content, writing, quote, that the film is determined to waste no time in offending its audience is borne out when Thorne addresses his black mate as boy before the film is even 2 minutes underway, end quote. After discussing the death of Rook, the film's only black character, Kane writes, quote, "Following some sort of primitive racist plan, the film, having disposed of the sole black cast member, next sacrifices the Mexican handyman Mario," end quote. In his 1995 book Sleaze Creatures, an illustrated guide to obscure Hollywood horror movies 1956 to 1959, author D. Earl Worth tackles this issue, writing, quote, "Considered racist by a few were the consecutive demises of Rook and Mario. In the dichotomy of most film disasters, a few expendables must go regardless of race, creed, or color. Admittedly, the terror of Rook was sadistically relished. A screaming obese black man dangling about the ravenous shrews must have delighted some of the redneck trade anticipating the shrews' consumption of dark meat. Thorne at least cared about Rook, and only followed that unimportant Mario, awkward Radford, and cowardly Jerry were next," end quote. I bring this issue up because the dialogue around this topic of who dies first in horror films has long been a subject of controversy and debate among the genre's aficionados and its critics, particularly with regard to race. A black character dies first in many horror and sci-fi films, including Spider Baby, Kingdom of the Spiders, New Year's Evil, Christine, Friday the 13th Part 3, Gremlins, Aliens, Jurassic Park, Ticks, The Crow, The Edge, John Carpenter's Ghost of Mars, Scream 2, which as you might expect also calls attention to this trope, and plenty of other films both inside and out of these two genres. However, this trope gets notably reversed in several horror films, including George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, as well as Dawn of the Dead. Now, I think, but I can't be certain, that this might be the first horror film to traffic in this specific narrative decision, in part because significant roles for black actors in these genre films were practically non-existent up to this point. Therefore, on one hand, it's a mark of progress that Rook exists within this world. On the other hand, though, it's definitely far from ideal that he's the first character killed off. Given this film's influence on Night of the Living Dead, George Romero's inversion of what we're seeing here with its foregrounding of Ben, a black protagonist played by Dwayne Jones, becomes that much more significant. I'll talk more later about the specific parallels between these two films.
I'll take a dull, alive woman every time.
We just left yet another scene that featured Anne and Thorne on that couch. They seem to spend half the movie on that thing. I thought that given this film's deep Texas roots, it would be interesting to dig back through the state's local newspapers to see how they reviewed both this and the Giant Gila Monster since they played together. It might surprise you to learn that this film garnered anything other than universally negative reviews. The Austin American newspaper said that this film and the Giant Gila Monster were, quote, horror shows in every sense of the word, end quote. But the Wichita Falls Times really liked it, especially once the shrews turned their attention to devouring the humans. Its reviewers said, quote, "The ravenous attack on a moon-drenched night is unparalleled in realistic suspense. The motion picture patron who projects himself totally into the plight of the four terrified survivors will feel the force of horror when he is left with their decision, whether it is better to wait and pray that the deadly shrews will, at last, die of starvation, or wiser to gamble on a dangerous dash through the island underbrush to the safety of the sea." End quote. The Abilene Reporter-News was less impressed, but tried to find something good to say about the local production, writing, quote, "Killer Shrews is a somewhat better picture than Gila Monster because it has real shrews. Neither of these pictures is really very good, but they have a sort of freshness and naivete that seems to make them lovable like a member of the family. And every now and then you see a familiar setting if you know Dallas County." End quote. It should be noted this picture does not have real shrews. But maybe that speaks to how realistic those dogs and puppets seemed to a reviewer in 1959. The Waco News-Tribune reviewer, Ginter Quill, sounds annoyed but grudgingly accepting of the final product, beginning his write-up by referencing McClendon's stated belief in his ability to make a sellable picture, and then saying, quote, "His confidence was undoubtedly bolstered by the acquisition of 1. Scriptwriters thoroughly acquainted with the formula, whether for action-adventure or horror story, and shrewd enough to avoid expensive interior sets, 2. A director who knows what to do with it, and 3. The requisite financing, which in this case apparently was comparatively little. Actors, though a necessary commodity, were secondary. Even Mr. McClendon gets in on the act. The director in both these instances is a good one, Ray Kellogg, who knows how to frame a picture, build suspense, concentrate on action, and handle people in special effects. Under his steering, they get a lot more mileage than they warrant." End quote. I'll talk more about Ray Kellogg in a minute. My favorite of the local reviews, though, comes from Marie Stevenson of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, who begins her review this way, quote, "Gordon McClendon makes movies on the same level as he operates a radio station in this area." End quote. Ouch. Stevenson's coming in hot. She continues by saying the Killer Shrews, quote, "purports to be the story of the results of some experimentation with little bitty animals that turn to great big monsters with voracious appetites. The shrews, which appear to be dogs with spots painted on, some hair glued on, and some false fangs slipped in, trap some people on an island. Although deplorable artistically, the movie here and there displays the fact that even its maker didn't take it seriously. The maker, in fact, appears in the Killer Shrews, which proves he has a sense of humor. The theater Thursday was full of youngsters who cheered, booed, and once in a while hissed the action. Although giving vent more freely than is the way of the professional, they proved to be the right fair critics." End quote. But one non-local review stuck out to me as a notable outlier. In fact, shocked would be a good word to describe my reaction to it. Industry trade paper Variety, which is never a publication to shy away from taking a poor film to task, gave this movie a positive review, praising multiple aspects of it. Here, listen to this. Quote, "Able acting bits are contributed by James Best as the riverboat captain and blonde Ingrid Good. Supporting roles are capably handled by Ken Curtis, Baruch Lumet, Gordon McClendon, and Judge Dupree. As a horror film, it's quite good under the economics involved. Assets include excellent direction by Ray Kellogg, fine lighting and photography in the numerous outdoor shots. Special effects by Kellogg, especially in close-ups of the huge shrews, are first-rate." End quote. First-rate? Really? I should also note here that many newspapers, including those in Texas, couldn't get the film's title right, calling it Killer Shrew, singular. And when one critic lobbed the accusation at McClendon that this film was one of the worst movies ever made, he showed a self-deprecating sense of humor when firing back, quote, "I resent your allegation that The Killer Shrews was one of the worst movies of all time. I made 2 other movies that were worse than that." End quote. He's not wrong.
Got 20 rounds altogether.
Here comes pathetic old Jerry, never one to pass up an opportunity to make the worst possible decision.
Sherman.
You heard the name Ray Kellogg mentioned in those reviews, always being signaled out for praise. Kellogg directed all 3 films from McClendon's short-lived original tenure as a film producer. Up to that point, Kellogg had worked at 20th Century Fox as one of the industry's best special effects experts, including on the 1951 sci-fi classic The Day the Earth Stood Still. Directing these 3 films did not provide him with the springboard into the directorial career he might have imagined, since after this he was stuck with mostly second-unit work on pictures such as Cleopatra, the 1966 Adam West starring Batman, and Tora Tora Tora. He only got one more shot in the director's chair, and even then he shared it with John Wayne when they co-directed the Green Berets. And if you're thinking, well, if he was such a special effects whiz, why did these shrew effects look so bad? It's likely because of factors that were completely outside of his control. He had less than a week to shoot the film and almost no money to make it, so he was a far cry removed from the big budgets, generous time frames, and collaborative resources of 20th Century Fox.
I gotta find him.
The golden age of the science fiction film is undoubtedly the 1950s, and the definitive book on the subject is undoubtedly Bill Warren's Keep Watching the Skies, American Science Fiction Movies of the 50s. The one-volume 21st Century edition runs 1,004 pages and feels like it weighs about 10 pounds. Since Warren is such an authority on this era, it's worth including his more contemporary viewpoint. In his entry for the film, he provides a balanced perspective, calling out what he sees as both the good and the bad. He starts by saying, quote, "For a bad film, The Killer Shrews is surprisingly good," end quote. He says the plot features a degree of logic and intelligence uncommon to low-budget sci-fi films of the era, highlighting the climactic escape as an example, because while it might look ridiculous, it plays by the rules of the film's own internal logic with regard to the strengths and weaknesses of the shrews. He says that before watching it, he was ready to find plenty wrong with it, but that its portrayal of shrews outside of their shape and giant size seemed scientifically accurate. Quote, "Even more to my surprise, the film played fair in all departments. The dialogue is pretty bad, but the acting is generally good, and unlike many low-budget films, The Killer Shrews doesn't try anything it can't really do. It delivers sudden shocks, and director Ray Kellogg handles suspense scenes remarkably well," end quote. He wraps up his thoughts on it by saying the film, quote, "recapitulates the science fiction movies of the 1950s in miniature. Partly stupid, partly inspired," end quote. In issue 104 of Video Watchdog, novelist and longtime film critic Tim Lucas makes an astute observation about the film's plot, writing, quote, "Appropriately for a film made in Dallas, it was possibly the first horror film to redress a classic tenet of the Western, the siege, in fantastic terms, replacing Indians and homesteaders with terrified people in a vulnerable house with limited ammunition trying to repel monsters starved for human flesh. As such, its influence on Romero's Night of the Living Dead and its sequels is a given," end quote. His review was the first time I'd seen someone make an explicit connection between this film and Night of the Living Dead, but I've since discovered others making similar claims. In fact, some enterprising soul uploaded a comparison video to YouTube showing how this scene is recreated sometimes almost shot for shot in Romero's seminal 1968 zombie film, when Ben is trying to get inside to escape the zombie hordes. I have to say, some of the similarities when synced up and viewed in tandem seem too strong to be simply coincidental. I should also note that Lucas has a couple of nice things to say about the film, writing, quote, "The film is decently suspenseful, and the shrew effects, carpet-covered dogs, puppetized hands, unnerving chattering sounds, are better than competent for their time," end quote. What's not competent are these fake punches Best throws at Curtis. They never seem to get within 1.5 feet of his face.
For heaven's sakes, Doctor, stop him!
I like to imagine the teenagers in the original audience chanting, "Do it, do it." A lot of actors end up with one role that, for better or worse, defines their image in the public consciousness, and for James Best, that role was Roscoe P. Coltrane in the hugely popular TV show The Dukes of Hazzard, which originally ran from 1979 to 85 and then in perpetuity in syndication. But for Best, identifying him solely by that role excises an entire swath of work he did before and after the show, including this part as Thorn.
All right, didn't he have it coming, or didn't he?
What happened out there?
Oh, nothing much. Jerry just tried to kill me twice in the last 5 minutes. Rook came ashore last night. He's dead. This is all was left. Won't do us any good, it's got no ammo.
I'm deeply sorry, Captain. I wish you had followed your orders.
Look, Doctor, you casually mentioned animals. You didn't explain to us what we were facing out there.
You had every right to feel the way you do. My mistake was only mine. It was one of judgment. I didn't know about the hurricane. I didn't anticipate the effect it would have on the shrews. I thought the house would be safe through the crisis.
How could you expose your own daughter? How could you expose Anne to that?
She was going to leave last week, but the boat didn't come.
I need a drink.
Viewers often create drinking games for bad movies and TV shows, but this film might offer the most straightforward opportunity to play. Just take a drink every time a character takes a drink. You'll be passed out within the first half hour. This is a great jump scare. It definitely got me the first time I watched the film. And then we get to McClendon's wonderful death scene.
Slam the door!
You all right, Doctor?
He just ripped my trousers, that's all.
Are you sure that's all there is?
I'm completely aware of it, Doctor.
You have to admire Radford's commitment to the project, typing up his symptoms in the seconds before he collapses onto his typewriter. Yep, drink up, Jerry. Okay, back to James Best. He had a Dickensian childhood, born in 1926 as one of 9 children in his family. They lived in rural Kentucky until the Great Depression hit, and then, too poor to provide for their kids, his parents gave them all up for adoption. James ended up with an Indiana family. Once World War II hit and he ended up in the Army, he got the acting bug auditioning for a part in My Sister Eileen. After he got it, he toured throughout Europe with the Army Special Services. His director during that military stint was none other than Arthur Penn, who would go on to direct such films as The Miracle Worker, The Chase, Bonnie and Clyde, Little Big Man, and Night Moves. When Best got back, he spent some time eking out a living on Broadway, then signed into Universal Pictures' second-to-none contract player program, which was designed to do everything it could to craft the next generation of young stars. The program created such actors as Tony Curtis and Rock Hudson, who were there at the same time as Best. During that time, he also became friends with war hero turned actor Audie Murphy and appeared in a lot of westerns, including a small part in Winchester 73. But his Universal days came to an abrupt end when he started going out with a young woman, who was also dating a studio executive. As he remembered it, quote, "It was a kiss and tell situation. I kissed and she told," end quote. From there, as a free agent, he kept grinding away in character roles and uncredited bit parts, including in sci-fi films of varying quality. He's Charlie the Radio Man in The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, Dr. Sidney K. Fuller in Riders to the Stars, and an unnamed crew member in Forbidden Planet. And there he was, finally giving the audience the cathartic moment of seeing Jerry get beaten to a pulp. Best took this part at the urging of his friend, the screenwriter turned director Samuel Fuller, who asked him to do him a favor by helping out his friend Ray Kellogg. In an interview that ran in the winter 1994 issue of Psychotronic Video, Best recalled, quote, "Ray Kellogg was one of the best special effects men in Hollywood, and Ray was going to direct his first movie. I took the picture. My book I'm writing is called Hollywood Never Made Me Cry. If anything was to make me cry, Killer Shrews would have done it. We actually would paint the sets and we would shoot the scene. You couldn't touch the set because you'd get paint on your hands," end quote. Best did write that book, but changed the title to Best in Hollywood, The Good, the Bad, and the Beautiful. In it, he has nothing good to say about making this film, except for some lascivious comments about Ingrid Good, which he would repeat variations of seemingly every time he was asked about working on this movie. He starts his chapter on this film this way, quote, "There are times when an actor is better off just beating his head against a wall. As Exhibit A, I present you with the Killer Shrews," end quote. And as for those painted sets, he said they were constantly walking sideways to avoid getting paint on their clothes because they didn't have enough money to buy a second set of wardrobe. Best also says he liked McClendon, but that McClendon couldn't act to save his life. Here's what he said about his death scene we just watched. Quote, "The writers wrote a scene that had one of the shrews bite Gordon and kill him, so we did not have to put up with his terrible acting anymore," end quote. He also explains how they shot a scene we watched earlier when the dogs as the shrews were chasing him through the woods. When it came time for the movie Shrews to chase Best's character, here's how Best recalls the ad hoc troubleshooting the production employed. Quote, "They didn't know how to make the dogs chase me, and so we got a raccoon. We put him in a crate and drug him up there, and it left a scent. Now, wherever they drugged the raccoon, that's where I would run. They hollered, "Roll it," and I took off running. Well, those dogs looked exactly like they were following me. And I looked back and I wasn't sure they weren't. They had these fake fangs standing up. After a while, I found myself running for real." End quote. Before we run out of time, I want to explain where this film fits in the sci-fi films of the 50s. At the decade's start, the modern sci-fi genre was still in its nascent form, offering up modest but ambitious efforts in 1950, such as the Let's Go to the Moon space films Rocket Ship XM and Destination Moon. But by the mid-50s, other subgenres had emerged, including the one into which this film fits, the mutant killer animal film, which fits under the larger umbrella of the monster movie. A couple of notable efforts in this area are 1953's The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms and 54's giant mutant ant thriller Them. These films set the standard for what would follow, including in this movie. Either one scientist or a group of them start screwing around, usually with nuclear material, and end up accidentally creating a monster out of an existing animal. These two films take different paths to the same kind of story. In Them, nuclear testing creates giant killer ants. In 20,000 Fathoms, atomic testing raises a frozen dinosaur that then goes on a rampage. This is a brutal moment here as Thorne blowtorches a shrew. Them would prove hugely influential, paving the way for lots of other stories featuring either a gigantic or miniature version of an animal, human, or otherworldly monster, usually created by scientific ineptitude and/or malfeasance. By 1955, films as varied as The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, Godzilla, It Came from Beneath the Sea, The Black Scorpion, The Monster That Challenged the World, Tarantula, The Deadly Mantis, Giant from the Unknown, The Incredible Shrinking Man, The Amazing Colossal Man, and Revenge of the Colossal Man, the Lou Costello comedy The 30-Foot Bride of Candy Rock, The Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, Attack of the Puppet People, Attack of the Giant Leeches, The Spider, The Fly, The Giant Behemoth, and of course the Giant Gila Monster, among numerous other films, had all riffed on this idea in one way or another. And as you can tell just from the titles, a lot of these poor mutants are insects.
You're right off that road! I told you I'm not going! I'm staying here!
You've got to get them down here somehow. And see if you can coax them down here.
Jerry, please come down with us.
No, Ann, they'll get you if you go out.
Come down here, you fool! Poor devil, I hope he makes it.
We can't leave him. He's not responsible for himself.
He's got to go now.
I love that little shrew hand that sticks through the wall. And poor Jerry, an idiot to the end. A lot of these films require a mad scientist, which is arguably the oldest character type in science fiction, since that character harkens all the way back to the first science fiction novel from 1818, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. This film is no exception, with, as I talked about earlier, Dr. Craigus behind the deadly experiments. And to a film, they all carry some warning about employing increasingly powerful technology, this is the Cold War after all, in service of goals that humans should not, these stories argue, have the power to pursue. This film is certainly no exception to that rule. By the time of its release, this narrative path about runaway science experiments had been tread and retread practically to the point of exhaustion. In case you're wondering if the production got stunt doubles to duck walk those barrels into the water, the answer is no. Here's how Best remembers shooting this scene. Quote, "Now it was in December or January in Texas and there was a thin layer of ice around the lake. They said, 'We'll have blankets and brandy for you when you get to the boat.' So we walked under these stupid barrels until we get down to the water and then we dove under and swam to the boat. I have never been so cold in my life." End quote. But he said that being with Ingrid Good made it better. Quote, "I wrapped the blanket around Ingrid and hugged her as tight as possible and shot 2 or 3 brandies. After a while, I didn't care if I was cold or not." End quote. As we wrap up here, I should mention that, believe it or not, this film has 2 remakes and a sequel. As Tom Weaver points out in his Fangoria review of the Wes Craven-produced 2006 horror film The Breed, the film in question has so many similarities to this movie that it seems to be a loose remake of what we're watching. And that's not the first one. The second one was a $3,000 micro-budget reimagining that came out in 2016. In 2003, screenwriter Steve Latshaw used this film and The Beast from Haunted Cave as inspiration for his film The Curse of the Komodo, but Latshaw didn't want to stop there. James Best, who was longtime friends with them, credits Latshaw with pushing him to pursue a sequel to this film. In an interview about it for a 2013 Indianapolis Star interview, Best remembers this as his initial reaction. Quote, "Are you kidding me? That piece of garbage?" End quote. But it wasn't long before the two men started bandying about ideas for it, a process that stretched across decades. Lanshaw said that it was around 2009 that they really started to drill down on the script, and by 2010 they had completed it and were ready to put together the financing. Best called in a couple of markers by getting his Dukes of Hazzard co-stars John Schneider and Rick Hurst to star alongside him. And just like in 1959, this shoot was a quick one. This time they did it all in 10 days. Here you go, the moment we've all been waiting for. I love the way Curtis kicks up his legs at the end of Jerry's death scene here, just to give it a little something extra. Like I said, Curtis is just absolutely the MVP of this movie. At age 85, just 3 years before he passed away, Best reprised his role as Sherman for Return of the Killer Shrews, and this time he's a boat captain who takes a reality TV crew to make a show on the same island, where, unbeknownst to them all, the Shrews somehow survived for over 50 years, which throws the science of this original movie into serious questions since the Shrews should have long since starved to death. What's interesting is that the 2013 article says Best hadn't given a thought to a sequel until Latshaw pitched it to him, and his 1994 Psychotronic interview concludes with a note that he was working on a script for a Killer Shrews sequel, so the follow-up film was long in the works. In his book, Best mentions that they were planning to shoot the sequel in 3D, although somewhere along the way that idea got scrapped. Return of the Killer Shrews wouldn't be released until 2012, 53 years after the original. The filmmakers even tried to get the Guinness Book of World Records to recognize this as the longest period of time between a film and its sequel. They wouldn't have been successful because Bambi 2 had already been released 64 years after the original, although they might have had a case if only counting live-action films that starred at least one of the same actors. Before my final comments, I want to say a huge thank you to Tom Weaver, an expert on this era and type of film. He was beyond generous with his time and resources as I was compiling my research for this track, so thank you, Tom. And now, I'll wrap it up by explaining what I appreciate about this film. While it's not even in the same orbit as the best of the decade's science fiction, there's an undeniable charm to witnessing a small, low-budget production made far from Hollywood's corridors of power achieve its admittedly modest goals. Is it great art? No. But it is, in its own ridiculous way, a fun movie provided you're in the right mood. You either get this kind of film or don't, and it's okay to poke fun at its mistakes while still appreciating the hustle that went into making it. If you enjoyed this film at all, I hope this track has provided you with a better understanding of who made it, why it was made, and where it fits under the umbrella of a great decade for science fiction films. And now I'll leave you with Best's corny final line and say, until next time, thanks for listening.
And he'll be dead of starvation. An excellent example of overpopulation.
Well, you know something, Doctor?
What's that?
I'm not going to worry about overpopulation just yet.